The morning sun filtered through the towering glass windows of the Arlington County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Judge Richard Harmon adjusted his black robe as he strode through the corridor toward courtroom 3, his leather shoes clicking authoritatively with each step. At 56, with silver-streaked dark hair and piercing blue eyes, he commanded respect without saying a word. "Morning, Your Honor," his clerk said, handing him a stack of files. "Light docket today, mostly minor infractions, one property dispute, and a few traffic violations." Richard nodded curtly, barely glancing at the files. After 20 years on the bench, these minor cases had become tedious formalities. He'd built his reputation on high-profile criminal cases, and these routine matters felt beneath him. "The Rodriguez property case is first," his clerk continued. "Then we have Elena Diaz, contested parking violation." Richard paused. "Diaz? Wasn't that the one who submitted that ridiculous handwritten appeal?" "Yes, sir. The single mother who works at the hospital cafeteria." He scoffed. "Well, this should be quick." Inside the courtroom, Richard took his seat at the bench, scanning the roommates with practiced indifference. The morning proceeded predictably until Elena Diaz's case was called. Elena approached the defendant's table, clutching a worn leather purse and a manila folder filled with carefully organized papers. At 42, her face showed the weathering of hard work and worry, but held a quiet dignity in her posture. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple blouse and skirt, clearly her best outfit, though far from new. "Ms. Diaz," Richard began, not bothering to hide his impatience. "You're contesting a parking violation issued on March 12th outside Arlington General Hospital. According to the officer's report, your vehicle was parked in a loading zone for over 3 hours." "Yes, Your Honor," Elena replied, her voice soft but steady. "I was working a double shift that day because another cafeteria worker called in sick. There was a snowstorm, and the regular parking lot was full because the plows hadn't—" "Ms. Diaz," Richard interrupted, "the weather is irrelevant. The sign clearly states, 'No parking, loading zone only.' Can you read English?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor's cheeks flushed, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, Your Honor, I can read English. I've been a citizen for 15 years. "Then you understand that your personal circumstances don't exempt you from following the law," Richard continued, his tone dismissive. "Everyone has problems, Ms. Diaz. The hospital has a staff parking garage." "The staff garage is only for doctors and nurses, Your Honor," Elena explained. "Kitchen staff must use the main lot, which was full because of the snow. I couldn't risk being late for my shift." "So, you decided the rules simply didn't apply to you?" Richard raised an eyebrow, glancing at the courtroom, with a small, knowing smile. Several attorneys chuckled softly. Elena straightened her shoulders. "No, Your Honor. I knew I might get a ticket, but I had no choice that day. I've never had a violation before. I'm asking for leniency because the fine is almost 2 days' wages for me." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Diaz, this court sees dozens of people every day, all with their own unique excuses. If I made exceptions for everyone with a sad story, what would be the point of having laws at all?" The courtroom fell silent as Elena looked directly at Richard, neither defiant nor intimidated. "I understand, Your Honor. I'm not asking for special treatment, just fairness." Something about her steady gaze made Richard uncomfortable. He shuffled the papers before him. "The fine stands at $175. Next case." As Elena gathered her papers, Richard noticed a young man rise from the gallery and hurry to help her. The man, probably in his early 20s, whispered something to Elena that made her smile despite the outcome. As they walked out, Richard caught a glimpse of the young man's face, his features reminiscent of Elena's, but with youth and determination brightening his expression. For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard felt a sudden unease. As the next defendant approached, he found himself distracted, Elena's dignified composure lingering in his thoughts. 2 weeks later, Richard sat in his cherry-paneled study at home, nursing a glass of single malt scotch. Rain pelted against the windows of his Georgetown townhouse, matching his dark mood. The morning newspaper lay open on his desk, displaying an article about his recent ruling in a high-profile embezzlement case. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Richard frowned, not expecting visitors on a dreary Sunday evening. His housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, appeared at the study door. "Judge Harmon, there's a young man at the door. Says his name is Miguel Diaz, and it's urgent he speaks with you." Richard furrowed his brow. "Diaz?" The name triggered recognition, though he couldn't immediately place it. He set down his glass and followed Mrs. Winters to the foyer, where a young man stood dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. Recognition dawned. It was the young man from the courtroom, Elena Diaz's son. "Mr. Diaz," Richard said coolly, "this is highly irregular. If this concerns your mother's case, you need to file an appeal through proper channels, not come to my private residence." Miguel shifted uncomfortably, but maintained eye contact. "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Honor, but this isn't about the parking ticket. It's about Arlington General Hospital." Richard's irritation gave way to confusion. "The hospital? What about it?" "There's been an accident. A driver lost control in the rain and crashed into the ER entrance. Several people are injured, including my mother who was on duty. They're evacuating patients to other hospitals." Miguel hesitated. "I'm a first-year resident at Georgetown Medical Center. When I heard about the accident, I volunteered to help coordinate. We need to set up a temporary field hospital to stabilize patients before transport, and we're looking for nearby buildings to use. Your home is the closest suitable location." Richard stared at him, processing the request. "You want to use my house as a medical facility?" "Just the ground floor, Your Honor, for a few hours at most. The storm has flooded the roads to Washington Memorial and ambulances can't get through. There are patients who won't survive the longer route to Georgetown." Richard looked past Miguel to the street, where he could now see emergency vehicles and medical personnel setting up under portable canopies. The rain was coming down harder. "This is absurd," Richard said. "There must be better options. I can't have my home turned into a triage center." Miguel's expression hardened. "With all due respect, Your Honor, people's lives are at stake, including my mother's. She's trapped under debris, and rescue crews are working to free her now." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Elena Diaz, the woman he'd dismissed so easily, was now fighting for her life just blocks away. "The nearest alternative is 20 minutes away in good weather," Miguel continued. "Tonight, that could mean 40 minutes or more. For someone with internal bleeding or a collapsed lung, that's the difference between life and death." Richard looked at the young man before him, composed and professional, despite the fear he must be feeling for his mother. In that moment, he saw a reflection of Elena's quiet dignity. "Mrs. Winters," Richard called, decision made. "Help clear the furniture in the living room and dining room. Mr. Diaz, tell your team they can use this house as needed." Within minutes, Richard's immaculate home became a flurry of controlled chaos. Paramedics brought in patients on stretchers, doctors called out vital signs, and nurses set up IV stands beside his antique furniture. Richard found himself holding pressure on wounds, fetching supplies, and comforting terrified patients. Roles entirely foreign to his judicial persona. 4 hours into the crisis, a team brought in a new patient. Richard froze when he recognized Elena Diaz on the stretcher, unconscious and badly injured. "Multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, broken ribs," a paramedic reported as they transferred her to a makeshift bed in what had been Richard's dining room. Miguel appeared, his scrubs bloodied from treating other patients. His face paled at the sight of his mother. "How is she?" The attending physician looked grim. "We need to stabilize her before transport. The bleeding's severe." Richard stood back, watching as the medical team worked frantically to save Elena's life. In that moment, all his judicial authority meant nothing. He was just another helpless bystander, watching professionals like Elena and her son fight to preserve what truly mattered. The storm finally subsided around dawn. Roads gradually cleared, allowing patients to be transferred to proper medical facilities. As emergency personnel packed up equipment, Richard's home slowly returned to its former state, though nothing would ever be quite the same. Richard sat on his porch steps, exhausted. Miguel approached, equally drained but with relief evident in his posture. "They've taken my mother to Georgetown," he said. "The surgery went well. The doctor thinks she'll recover fully." Richard nodded. "I'm glad to hear it." An awkward silence stretched between them before Miguel spoke again. "Thank you for opening your home, Your Honor. You saved lives tonight." Richard waved away the gratitude. "I did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Miguel replied. "Many wouldn't have helped, especially not someone they'd—" He trailed off. "Someone they dismissed in court," Richard finished for him, the words bitter on his tongue. Miguel studied him. "My mother doesn't hold grudges, you know. She understood you were just doing your job." Richard laughed humorlessly. "Was I? Or was I just being callous because I could be?" He stood up, stretching his stiff back. "Your mother works in the hospital cafeteria." "For 12 years now," Miguel nodded. "She took the job when we first came to Arlington because it offered health insurance. She kept it because it allowed her to save enough to help put me through medical school." Richard's gaze sharpened. "Medical school? You're not just a resident." "4th year at Georgetown. The residency starts next month." A hint of pride colored Miguel's voice. "Mom worked double shifts for years so I could focus on my studies instead of taking a second job." The judge felt a strange hollowness in his chest. "How does she get to work each day?" "Bus, usually. Sometimes she borrows my car when our schedules align. The day she got the ticket, the buses weren't running because of the storm." Each new detail made Richard increasingly uncomfortable with his previous judgment. "Mr. Diaz," Miguel, "would you mind if I visited your mother once she's recovered somewhat?" Surprise flashed across the young doctor's face. "I think she'd like that, actually." 3 days later, Richard entered Arlington General Hospital, carrying an arrangement of yellow daisies, a choice that had seemed cheerful in the flower shop, but now struck him as inadequate. He followed the directions to the recovery ward, feeling increasingly out of place. He found Eleanor sitting up in bed, her face bruised but her eyes alert. She looked startled to see him. "Your Honor," she said, adjusting her position slightly. "This is unexpected. Please call me Richard," he said, placing the flowers on her bedside table. "How are you feeling?" "Better each day," she replied. "The doctors say I was very lucky." Richard nodded awkwardly. "Your son is quite remarkable. His quick thinking saved many lives that night, including yours possibly." Elena's face softened with maternal pride. Miguel has always known exactly what needed to be done, ever since he was small. She gestured to a chair beside her bed. "Please, sit if you like." Richard sat, feeling strangely like he was the one being judged now. "Miss Diaz." "Elena, please." "Eleanor," he amended. "I owe you an apology. The way I spoke to you in my courtroom was unacceptable." She studied him. "You spoke to me the way powerful people often speak to those they consider beneath them. It wasn't personal." Her matter-of-fact assessment was more devastating than any accusation. "That doesn't make it right," Richard said quietly. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." An orderly came in with lunch, a bland-looking tray of hospital food. Elena thanked him with genuine warmth. "You know," she said after he left, "I usually help prepare these meals. I never realized how much courage it takes to eat them." She smiled, and Richard found himself smiling back. "I've been thinking about your case," he said suddenly. "The parking violation." Elena shook her head. "Please don't worry about that. I've already paid the fine." "You have?" Richard frowned. "Miguel insisted on helping, but I wanted to handle it myself. Rules are rules, as you said." Her quiet dignity struck him again, this time with the full force of recognition. While he'd been dwelling on his own discomfort and guilt, Elena had simply moved forward, facing her responsibilities without complaint. "Tell me about your work here," he said impulsively. Elena looked surprised, but began describing her daily routine. arriving at 5 a.m. to prepare breakfast, the chaotic lunch hours, the careful planning required to feed hundreds of people with different dietary needs. The patients never see us, she explained, but what we do affects their recovery. Good nutrition, presented carefully, it matters. As she spoke, Richard realized she approached her cafeteria work with the same seriousness of purpose he aspired to on the bench. The difference was that Elena never lost sight of the human lives affected by her work. When a nurse came to check Elena's vitals, Richard stood to leave. "May I visit again?" Elena considered him for a moment. "I'd like that." As Richard walked back to his car, the hospital corridors seemed different, not just hallways of institutional efficiency, but pathways connecting countless human stories. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own blindness. 6 months later, Richard sat in courtroom 3, listening to a young woman explain why she couldn't pay her overdue utility bills. Unlike before, he was genuinely listening, not just to her words, but to the circumstances behind them. "Miss Patel," he said when she finished, "I'm going to refer you to the county's emergency assistance program. They can help with immediate payment to prevent disconnection. I'm also ordering a 3-month structured payment plan for the remainder." Relief washed over the woman's face. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she gathered her papers, Richard added, "And Ms. Patel, the community college has a free financial literacy program on Tuesday evenings. I've seen it help many people in similar situations." His clerk gave him a curious look as the woman left. These interventions had become common in Judge Harmon's courtroom, particularly since his medical residency, as some courthouse staffers jokingly called it. Word had spread about the night the austere Judge Harmon had turned his Georgetown townhouse into an emergency field hospital. But few knew about the friendship that had developed afterward between the judge and Elena Diaz. Their weekly coffee meetings had started as Richard's attempt at atonement, but evolved into something neither expected, a genuine connection that challenged and enriched them both. Elena had returned to work in the hospital cafeteria, now with the title of Nutrition Services Coordinator, a promotion Richard had nothing to do with, though he felt unreasonably proud when she told him about it. After court adjourned, Richard gathered his files and headed to the hospital. Today was special, Miguel Diaz's graduation ceremony from his residency program. Richard had been surprised and touched when Elena asked if he would attend. He arrived to find Elena waiting outside, dressed in a new blue dress, her face glowing with maternal pride. "He did it," she said as they walked in together. "First in our family to finish college, and now a doctor." "He's exceptional," Richard agreed, though I suspect he had an exceptional example to follow. The ceremony was moving, particularly when Miguel was called forward to receive special recognition for his actions during the hospital crisis. Afterward, at a small reception, Miguel approached them, still in his ceremonial robes. "I'm glad you could come, Judge Harmon," he said, shaking Richard's hand. "I wouldn't have missed it," Richard replied honestly. "Your mother has been counting down the days." Miguel smiled at his mother. "Mum, can I borrow the judge for a moment?" Elena nodded, moving to greet other well-wishers. Miguel led Richard to a quiet corner. "I wanted to thank you properly, not just for that night, but for everything since." Richard shook his head. "If anyone should be thanking anyone—" "Please," Miguel interrupted, "let me say this. I was angry at you for a long time after that day in court. I thought you were just another powerful person who enjoyed making others feel small." Richard winced, but didn't deny it. "But what you did that night, and how you've been with my mother since then, it showed me something important about people's capacity to change." Miguel paused. "I'm going to be working with all kinds of patients now, some who've made terrible choices. Your example reminds me that transformation is always possible." Richard felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. "Your mother taught me what real dignity looks like. I'm still learning." "We all are," Miguel said. "By the way, I heard about the community court program you started. Mum says it's making a real difference." The program, which connected low-income defendants with social services instead of fines they couldn't pay, had been Richard's most controversial initiative. Several colleagues had criticized it as soft justice, but Richard had persisted, remembering Elena's words about rules needing humanity to be truly fair. "It's a small start," Richard said modestly. "Small starts matter," Miguel replied, echoing words Richard had heard from Elena many times. As they rejoined the celebration, Richard watched Elena laughing with her son's colleagues, her natural warmth drawing people to her. The woman he had once tried to humiliate now commanded his deepest respect, not because she had changed, but because he finally saw her clearly. Later that evening, as Richard drove home, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. A parking ticket, a storm, a moment of crisis, ordinary events that had shattered his carefully constructed worldview. In his courtroom the next morning, Richard looked out at the faces before him, not cases to be processed, but people with stories as complex and worthy as his own. He adjusted his robe and nodded to his clerk. "First case," he said, ready to listen.